Hi there, and welcome to this special episode in which we're going to take a look at our updated framework, NATTO 2.0. And we're going to take a sweeping look at some ideas, thoughts, principles, concepts that have been simmering in my mind for a long time. And I'm so excited to share them with you. In fact, if you attended the Festival of Understanding, you will see that this is an echo that a lot of the concepts we talked about during the festival we'll also talk about here. And speaking of something like simmering in my mind for a while, the kind of what has led up to this is a process that started really around the time of the first ever State of the NATTO Nation address, which was in December of 2022. If you tune into that, you will hear me talking about the grand unification theory, which is something I heard of, I believe, when I was a child or maybe a teenager. And I think this concept comes from the world of physics or maybe science in general. But I heard of it in the context of like people wanting to unify the work of Einstein, you know, the relativity, the theory of relativity, with the work of Bohr and others, and you know, the quantum physics space, and how they can't be like two sets of rules. Like they were looking for like a unification theory that could unify everything like that. And I was like, what if we could have that in our space, like in the within space, like, you know, a framework that, you know, really combines what looks like a multitude of struggles into one, or at least an understanding that can explain every aspect of what looks like many different things. Something like that has been simmering in my mind for a long time. And by the way, the ideas we're going to look at here today and NATTO 2.0, there's nothing principally new there. It's just like, it's ideas that have been present for thousands of years, but I think they're put together in a new way. And maybe this is also something that happens, you know, every few years. Somebody takes, you know, universal truths and put them together in a new way and whatnot. So nothing new about that, perhaps either. However, I'm starting to ramble, so let's just get to it. We're going to look at NATTO 2.0, and we're going to break it up into 5 segments. Number 1, the new insomnia definition. We're going to talk about tokenization. We're going to talk about befriending beyond wakefulness, and then we're going to talk about the universal code and the one struggle. So let's start at the very top, which is the new definition of insomnia. And a nice place to start, of course, is the old or the prior definition of insomnia. And by the way, we can actually start with the mainstream definition of insomnia. If you look at like a textbook or, you know, the ICD classification system or something like that, you will find wording that goes something like, if you've had trouble falling asleep or staying asleep for more than 3 days per week for more than 3 months, you have chronic insomnia. Which is, you know, when people say insomnia in the realm of medicine or psychology, it really refers to chronic insomnia, which is defined this way, like trouble falling asleep or trouble staying asleep for more than 3 nights per week for more than 3 months, you have chronic insomnia. That is the mainstream definition. And you could argue that a benefit of the mainstream definition is that it is very broad. It can encapsulate things like sleep apnea causing insomnia or shift work causing insomnia. Anything that leads to us having trouble falling asleep with a certain frequency can be labeled insomnia. However, there's also a limitation, and that is that it is purely descriptive. If you say, oh, I have a hard time falling asleep, you know, almost every night, and I have had that for 4 months now, and someone says, oh, you have chronic insomnia because you have trouble falling asleep more than 3 nights per week for more than 3 months, that doesn't necessarily help you, because it doesn't help you understand why you've had trouble sleeping, and therefore it doesn't give you any form of guidance as to what to do or how to leave this struggle, right? So the limitation with the mainstream definition is that it's just descriptive. It just describes what's happening without offering insight. So up until this point, we've been using a different definition of insomnia, and it's gone like this: that Insomnia is an ongoing, self-perpetuating struggle with sleep that is rooted in a fear of being awake at night. That's been how we've been looking at insomnia, and that has been very helpful. Thousands and thousands of people have left the struggle with sleep thanks to, in many parts, this definition of insomnia. However, this definition also has some limitations. For example, something that I've heard many times is a student telling me, "Hey, Daniel, I'm not scared. I'm not anxious. I'm just upset. I'm mad. I'm angry when I don't sleep, or the thought of not sleeping makes me angry or sad." Yeah, I've heard many people say, "I'm not scared. I'm just like feeling really drained and exhausted and sad and down, you know?" And you can see how when the definition of insomnia is that it is a struggle that comes from a fear of not sleeping, then it's hard to explain why there is not fear, but anger and sadness, right? So here we see a limitation of the prior definition. And it also, like, the prior definition of insomnia as a struggle rooted in fear of not sleeping, it also doesn't really get to the bottom of it, because you may ask why. Like, why are we scared of something? Why are we scared of anything? And if you ask yourself, why you're scared of the dark, for example, you may at first say, like, well, because it frightens me. But then you're just going in circles, right? Then you're not reach the truth behind why you're afraid of something. But if someone asks you why you're afraid of that, and you say, well, because I might get hurt, there might be something there that can hurt me, then you're onto the truth. We are scared of something because we think it may potentially harm us, that it is maybe dangerous to us. If we think we can get hurt, for example, that is the brain identifying something as a threat. If we think something can hurt us, then that thing has been identified as our brain as a threat. And when our brain is sensing a threat, it can deploy various emotional states to lead us out of danger. One of them is fear. Fear may lead to us escaping, the flight or fight. We can fight out of desperation to try to survive, right? Fear can lead to us surviving in that way. Anger can lead us to safety when we think, or our brain thinks, that confrontation is the most helpful thing facing a certain threat. Like, if this is a threat, then you can confront it. That's the best way. That's anger. Like, anger is practical in that way. We have sadness when we're facing a threat where there's no obvious path to surviving in terms of action. There's nothing we really can do to escape. Maybe the safest thing is to do nothing, to be sad. That keeps us from action. Sadness also elicits empathy from other people. That's the practical value of sadness as a survival emotion, as a safety emotion. And we have disgust also, which keeps us safe when something looks like it can hurt us, like food can look like it's harmful. We're identified food as a threat. Disgust is deployed, but also in social context, when we hear of somebody doing something that is just outside of social norms, that is revolting, we can feel disgusted. We don't want to associate ourselves with that person, right? That's the way we can survive in the context of us being like a social being. We don't want to associate with somebody that's done something that revolts us, because that may lead to us also being ostracized from the tribe and leads us to danger, right? So there are essentially these four safety emotions that the brain can deploy when it perceives something as a threat, which is anger, sadness, fear, and disgust. And so when we have our new definition, it solves all these limitations that we had before. So our new definition is that insomnia is an ongoing struggle rooted in mislabeling wakefulness as a threat. Thinking of being awake at night as a threat is what leads to insomnia. Insomnia is a struggle based on this mislabeling, if you will. And when we have a new definition like we do now, everything suddenly makes sense. We can now see that anger, sadness, fear, and disgust, are all seen when our brain perceives something as a threat. So if somebody says, I'm not scared, I'm just angry when I don't sleep, that now makes sense. Not sleeping is perceived as a threat, and the brain has chosen anger to try to confront this threat, right? Or sadness. The brain doesn't really see any solution, so we're just sad. All these emotional responses now make sense with our new definition. And by the way, when our brain perceives that there may be a threat here, something is potentially threatening, but it's not really clear perhaps which emotion to deploy, we may just be apprehensive. We can be like, maybe there's a threat. I'm going to be apprehensive, And that apprehension can keep us awake. So this new definition also explains the common phenomenon, which is, I'm not scared. I'm just not sleeping, right? That's like the brain is potentially seeing a threat, and it's just keeping us in this apprehensive state without us being really scared or angry or sad or having some tangible, strong emotional response that we can identify. We're just apprehensive, right? So this new definition is actually very, very helpful and practical. And one little comment here before we move on to talk about tokenization is that it is very helpful to see how the perception of something as a threat can lead to a loop. For example, if we randomly sleep a little because of some circumstance in our lives, but this leads to perception of us being in danger. We think not sleeping is a threat. Now we're perceiving that we're in some danger. That leads us to be hyper vigilant and hyper alert. And then we sleep little. Well, now that becomes a tricky situation because sleeping little has been identified as a threat. So now we are even more in this perception that we're in danger, which leads to more hypervigilance and less sleep and more of this perception that we're in danger, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see how this is a loop that we call insomnia. But this loop is not isolated to insomnia. It's a loop that we can see in other contexts as well, which we'll get to in a second. But I just want to point out how things can loop in this way. And with that, we have talked about our new definition, and we are going to move on to the second part of this talk, which is tokenization. Tokenization it's really a concept that I've been pondering and working with and trying to express also for years. And some of you may remember one or two classes that I uploaded here on YouTube that were called The Token and the Signal. I think it was actually two of them, The Token and the Signal. And that was when I was starting to formulate kind of a broader understanding, like sort of taking the insights we have from insomnia more broadly, right? But what this landed was here to this concept of tokenization, which I feel is really helpful. And so tokenization is defined as mislabeling something that's inherently harmless as a threat. So the brain identifies something that is not a threat as such. Something that is harmless is by mistake identified as a threat. That is tokenization. A tokenization event has occurred. And now if we go back to insomnia and ponder, so what tokenization event has occurred here? What is the token? What is the thing that is inherently harmless that is thought of as a threat when it comes to insomnia? That is wakefulness, and particularly wakefulness at night. So with insomnia, the token is wakefulness at night. And we can go back to this loops and see that when little sleep is tokenized, then we have hypervigilance and less sleep. And that leads to further tokenization of little sleep. So here you see this, we already expressed this, but now we're actually using language to help us communicate what our understanding is. So again, with insomnia, the token is wakefulness at night. And this may lead us to the following question of why this can occur. Like, how is it possible to make these mistakes? How can our brain, which is like arguably the most amazing, wonderful, fascinating thing in the universe, how can it make such silly mistakes? We may think. Well, To understand this, we want to think of our brain's role from an evolutionary perspective. It is there as something that is to keep us safe, right? Our brain is a survival machine, if you will. Not only the brain, but in fact, if you take a look at anything that is alive, you will see that every component part of it is there for survival. A tree has a stem so that it has structure on which it can have branches and the leaves are there so it can gather sunlight for energy. It has roots to absorb nutrients from the ground. Like, everything is there for survival, and nothing's different when it comes to us. We have eyes to see, we have eyebrows maybe to keep sweat from getting in our ears. We have ears to hear. We have teeth so we can eat. Like, everything is there for survival, and there's nothing different with our brain. It is really there to keep us safe. Survival is its one priority. So it is, of course, designed so that it can identify threats, so it can deal with those threats, right? That's what it's there for. That's a big part of what it's there for. Now, if we think about how we want the brain to operate, we can ask ourselves, do we want it to be sensitive, or do we want it to be specific? Do we want it to be sensitive or specific? And now, to answer this question, it helps to understand, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by the brain being sensitive or specific in the context of identifying threats? Well, a sensitive brain would identify all threats. It would go like, oh, that's a threat. Maybe that's a threat. Maybe that's a threat too. It would definitely not miss any threat, because it labels a lot of things as threats. But the kind of downside here, if you will, is that it identifies all threats, but it can misidentify non-threats as threats. So that's a sensitive brain. Now, a specific brain would never make this mislabeling or mistake, if you will. It would, everything that the specific brain would say is a threat, it would be a threat, because it would really be careful not to label something as a non-threat as a threat. So the specific brain, if it says something is a threat, it's going to be a threat, yes. However, it's also going to miss threats. Sometimes it's going to be like, that's probably not a threat. That's probably not a threat. That's probably not. We're only going to call this a threat because we're so sure this is a threat. So it's going to call it truly, but it's going to miss on a lot of threats, right? So now that you know this, you can ponder, what do we think is most helpful for us as humans? Is it to have a more sensitive brain or a more specific brain? Whatever you come up with, the answer actually has already been provided for us in the process that we call evolution, or survival of the fittest. We have seen that we have a sensitive brain. It can and is allowed to make this mistake, if you will, of labeling something that is not a threat as such, because we don't want to miss anything. Missing a threat could be catastrophic for us. And by the way, it's the same thing if you look in nature. Like, deer are very careful, like squirrels are very careful. Like, evolution has favored the brain that is highly sensitive when it comes to identifying threats. And where this leads us is to see that tokenization, labeling something that is not a threat as a threat, is actually a feature, not a bug. Our brain is supposed to do that. It's supposed to do that. However, not only is our brain designed to have that capacity to mislabel something harmless as a threat, but to reverse it as well. We can imagine that we're out gathering, food, and we hear something in the bushes. It sounds like, oh my gosh, there could be a tiger. And then we see, oh no, this is the bird. Okay, no problem, right? The brain labeled that sound as a threat, or at least a potential threat, but then saw that it wasn't, right? So it reversed its stance. Our brain has that capacity not only to tokenize, but to detokenize, to reverse the tokenization, if you will. Now, we already talked a little bit about loops. But we can see that loops, like the one we talked about earlier, where we saw little sleep led to a perception of danger and to little sleep, etc., is not unique to insomnia at all. In fact, loops can keep our brain from seeing there's no threat, especially when an internal event is tokenized. Like when a sound or something outside us has been tokenized, we can kind of investigate that and see that, oh, there's no real threat there. But when something inside us has been mislabeled as a threat, things become a little trickier. For example, if our brain has tokenized anxiety, and we use this nomenclature, if you will, of a T within parentheses to describe tokenization. So anxiety, parentheses T, means tokenized anxiety, which means that our brain has started to think of anxiety as a threat. So when anxiety has been tokenized, we can see how this leads to a loop. If we are experiencing everyday anxiety, like we all have, we're all anxious about something every day, like maybe very brief or not, but we all have like these everyday anxieties, right? And if they're not tokenized, they become fleeting. We're a little worried about something, then okay, that gets sorted. Okay, we're a little worried about something, that gets sorted, right? But if anxiety has been tokenized, what can happen is everyday anxiety makes us anxious because anxiety has been labeled as a threat. And when we're now more anxious, then we were sensing that, oh, this is the danger that I was trying to escape. We are currently even more in a state of threat, which makes us anxious, which makes that tokenization even stronger, which makes us more anxious. So you see, this is a loop, and this is the loop that we commonly refer to as general anxiety. General anxiety really can be expressed as tokenized anxiety. We can look at another example of this, which is jerks. If we have jerks as we're falling asleep, or just random or during the day, that is not uncommon. We all have those. We all have little jerks here and there, right? But if jerks are tokenized, what can happen is we have like this random jerk, and our brain goes, oh no, this is a threat. This is happening now. We become hyper aroused. And because we're kind of like our nervous system is in this like elevated state, we have more jerks, or we notice more of them. Either way, we sense that we are even more in danger now. This tokenization becomes stronger, and it leads to this hypervigilance, an active nervous system, more jerks, and now you see this can be a loop in and of itself. And there can be an innumerable number of loops. We can have the loop where pain has been tokenized. We started thinking of pain not just as an unpleasant sensation, but as something that represents danger, which makes us more sensitive to danger and makes us perceive more danger, which makes us think even more that we're threatened, which leads to this loop. Dizziness, same thing, right? We can all be a little dizzy every day, but if we think that this is a threat, that puts us in this hyperaroused state where we are often more dizzy, and that becomes its loop. Fatigue can be tokenized and lead to chronic fatigue, etc., etc. So what we're seeing here is that tokenization, the process of tokenization, does not only explain the struggle that we call insomnia, but that there is just one struggle, in fact, and they're all explained by tokenization. Tokenization is the common denominator of the inner struggle, of every variety of the one inner struggle as well. So tokenization really, really holds a central part in our NATTO framework, of which we are, looking at this update. So tokenization, again, is a key part of our framework. And now, when we come to this part where we talked about what the substrate for the inner struggle is, we naturally wonder how we'll leave it. How do we leave a struggle like insomnia or any other variety of the inner struggle? And this is where we're going to talk about our third topic, which is befriending beyond. And the beyond here really refers to beyond wakefulness. Many of you are very familiar with our work within insomnia. and have heard myself or other coaches here or students, followers talk about befriending wakefulness, which is no longer attempting to escape being awake at night, but experience wakefulness at night without attempting to get away from it. That is befriending wakefulness. But as we've seen just now, as we talked about tokenization, we can see that not only does befriending apply to the token that is not sleeping at night, when that has become tokenized, but really any other token as well. We can meet it in the same way with befriending. In other words, when tokenization leads to the inner struggle, we can see that reversing this tokenization is how the struggle is going to end. In other words, when our brain has identified something harmless as a threat, and that leads to a struggle, we can see that no longer identifying that as a threat, seeing that it is truly harmless, de-tokenization, reversing tokenization, if you will, is what will lead us to no longer have this struggle. And we call this, the process of reversing tokenization, befriending. We call it befriending. Now, not only are we going to talk right now about how the befriending concept applies beyond wakefulness, but we have also expanded the concept into 3 elements, if you will. We have previously explored or expressed befriending wakefulness as an equivalent of exposure therapy. Exposure therapy, for those of you not familiar, is commonly used to help people that have phobias. Let's say you're scared of mice, then the treatment has been to expose yourself to mice in a gradual way. Maybe first read about them, study them, maybe touch one, something like that. That allows your brain to see that mice are not really dangerous, right? And we've used befriending wakefulness in a very similar way. When our brain has become, in kind of our prior language, we would say, when your brain has become afraid of not sleeping at night, what you want to do is show your brain that not sleeping at night is safe by not doing anything in particular when you find yourself awake at night. And we still think that this holds a lot of value. Now, how we would express it now is quite similar, with the only exception of saying that when our brain has identified being awake at night as a threat, we want to show our brain that it is not a threat. And partially, this is in that sense of exposure, finding a readiness within ourselves to be awake at night without doing anything to leave it. However, we added 2 other elements as well. So we're expanding befriending to include, again, 3 elements. And the first one is just the intellectual understanding, just on a conceptual level, on a awareness level, seeing that, for example, being awake at night is not a threat. It is not something that can harm us. It is not dangerous. And similarly, if somebody was struggling with tokenized anxiety, the first step, or at least one element of befriending, would be to understand that anxiety is simply an emotion. It is not something that is an actual threat, actually dangerous to us. So intellectual understanding is part of befriending, and this is in many ways what makes non-action possible. As long as we think there's a threat, we are in all likelihood going to try to escape it. We're going to have efforts. We're going to attempt to get away from it. So intellectual understanding is part of befriending. Because it allows non-action to be possible, and is helpful just in and of itself. So going from intellectual understanding, the second element of befriending is the one we talked about a little before. It is the exposure element. And although exposure therapy is something we hear a lot about from, let's say, the mainstream psychological world, it really means the same thing as acceptance, or letting go, or letting be, or non-reactivity, or many of these other words we hear that simply express non-doing, not doing anything in particular when we are facing something the brain thinks of as a threat. And this is the second element of befriending. And again, it's so helpful to point out that this is a non-doing. This is not an action, but it's the absence of any attempt to escape. And that's the second part of the befriending concept. And then we have self-kindness, which we really can look at as befriending ourselves. So often, the inner struggle is maintained by us thinking, we're not doing enough, we're not smart enough, we should have gotten further. And in these ways of really looking at ourselves as a threat in a way, or ourselves as the enemy, or ourselves or as somebody sabotaging, or ourselves as somebody who is insufficient. So self-kindness is a key element really of befriending. So we have seen here that tokenization is really a key part, because it explains the inner struggle, and we can meet tokenization. Whatever has been tokenized, we can meet in this generic way of befriending with these three elements. And I think at this point, you can sort of sense how a unification theory has emerged or is emerging, right? You can see from what we talked about just up until this point, you can see that we have taken what we have learned from our work in insomnia to apply truly broadly. And I hope everything has made sense to you so far. We have two more points to go over. And the fourth one is the universal code. And the universal code is it's a really helpful way to look at the elements that make up the human experience, if you will. And we're going to look at like a 4-version universal code that I think of as the cognitive cascade, because it's, it just flows in one direction, if you will. But let's start by exploring the universal code by looking at the common denominator among any helpful teachings. I think any framework, any school of thought that is helpful shares the understanding of the primacy of thought. And when I use the word thought here, I am not referring to, just thoughts that pop into our mind, or a thought in that way, but rather thought of as how we think about something, thought as interpretation or storytelling or narrative, or how we perceive things. So that's what I mean when I say primacy of thought. I mean the primacy of how we think about things, how we interpret things, how we see things. And again, as I mentioned, primacy of thought is an element of any helpful teaching. The most ancient one, as far as I know, is where this is mentioned or clearly documented, is in Buddhist philosophy, where we read about the 2 arrows teaching. And the 2 arrows teaching, it essentially goes something like this: that let's say you were strolling around in a beautiful garden, and a bee stings you, and then you become really upset. You wave your fist at the sky, and you curse in this day where this happened to you, right? Then there's been 2 arrows here. One is the first arrow is the bee stung you, which caused some pain, and the second arrow is your response to it. What you do, and often it is that second arrow that actually causes you to have much less of a pleasant experience. The suffering all comes from the second arrow. Some pain can come from the first arrow. It's the suffering that matters more. This is a classic Buddhist teaching. And what it teaches us is that it's the second arrow that matters. It is the primacy of thought that is perhaps a little disguised, because we think much more about behavior here. We think about like how we were waving our fist at the sky, and cursing and things like that, which doesn't sound like that's simply thought, but it all comes from thoughts, because it is how we thought about the fact that we were stung by a bee that leads to an emotional reaction, and leads to behavior, and leads to whatever result flows from there, right? So even here we see the primacy of thought. And the primacy of thought is not only found in Buddhist teaching as mentioned, it's also found, it's very, cornerstone of Stoicism. It's present in CBT, ACT, in metacognitive therapy, and many, many other frameworks. We see the primacy of thought being a cornerstone, and it is in ours as well, of course. Now, going back to the first and second arrow of philosophy, or teaching, I should say, we can call the first arrow circumstance. Circumstance is just whatever happens to us in our lives. The past is part of circumstance. Truth, like reality, things that happen without question, are circumstance, right? Things that happen in the universe that we cannot do anything about. That is circumstance. The second arrow really can be broken down into these four elements, which is thought, how we think about something, and the emotions those lead to, and the behaviors that are catalyzed by emotion, and then whatever result we choose to look at from there. So here we have it. This is the universal code. Circumstances can lead us to have thoughts about those circumstances. Emotions are produced by thoughts. Thoughts can catalyze behavior. And when I say catalyze, I mean, it's not like I can ask you what you do when you're angry, because that doesn't make sense. It depends on the context, right? It's not like every emotion has a predictable behavior attached to it. It's rather that depending on how we think of a circumstance, we can think up a behavior that may be kind of suggested, but it's the emotion that catalyzes. We may think I should do this, but unless we're maybe angry or sad or we have some emotional response, it's not going to catalyze the behavior, right? So emotion is sort of a catalyst here. And the result in the universal code here is like anything we want to look at. We can say that the result of, being stung by a bee was that we were stung by a bee. We can see the result of being stung by a bee was that we were waving our fist at the sky, or the result was that we never went, out on a stroll again. Like the result is a very flexible component, but essentially this is a universal code that explains really all aspects of the human experience. Now, when you say that this universal code really explains all that matters in terms of human experience, a common objection to that is when somebody says something like, well, what if someone hits you with a hammer really hard on your head? Like, are you saying that it's only because you think of that as unpleasant that becomes unpleasant? And the truth is that that's not the case. Anyone who hit themselves with a hammer or is hit with a hammer will, for a brief time, have their human experience completely dominated by pain. And it doesn't matter how we think of those circumstances. No, now we're outside of the universal code. True. Now a sensation is dominating our human experience. And a sensation is really anything we feel that is not produced by thought. Anything we feel that is produced by thought is an emotion. So this is how we differentiate emotion and sensation in our framework. So we want to say here that, yes, circumstances can dominate our life experience regardless of how we think about them, depending on kind of what sensation they give rise to. But this is the vast minority of our lives. The majority of our lives are spent in a state where how we think about circumstances and how we feel about them and how we behave really determine like our experience. If it's unpleasant, pleasant, if we're in a place of peace of mind or not, like all that is really determined by how we think of circumstances. And so just to stay a little bit longer on this topic, so we can of course be in a circumstance of like extreme heat or extreme cold or pain that can dominate for some time, but it's not going to be the majority of our life. Beautiful music can give us this like auditory sensation that's very, very pleasant, and that can dominate for a while. But then we start thinking about things, and our thoughts and our emotions, are much more longer lasting. Same thing with like drug-induced euphoria. For a while, that can be a dominant part of our experience, but not for very long, because soon enough we start thinking about things, and that starts to dominate. So yes, the universal code, again, it explains the dominant part of the human experience, and thought is upstream of all that matters. What I want to say here is that circumstances is nothing we have, like, it's just things that happen to us. So although like it starts with circumstance, the beginning of this kind of cascade that determines our life experience is the beginning that sort of matters to us is thought, because that's the one that can be influenced by a lecture like this and many other things that can really change our lives. Which leads us to the final part of this exploration here, which is the part I call the one struggle. And I was going to say this for last, but I find that this may be a good place to share this, that not only did I share many of these thoughts in our Festival of Understanding that some of you attended, which was really fun, by the way, thanks for being there. I also very recently concluded a book called Principles of NATTO, where I go much deeper into all of what we talked about here. And unlike my other books, which are mostly really for someone struggling with sleep, Principles of NATTO is really written for partly just for myself to clarify some of these thoughts I've been pondering for the longest. Also for somebody who is a coach or a counselor or somebody who wants to use our NATTO framework to help others. But of course, if you want a really deep understanding of our framework and just for out of curiosity or to help yourself, that is also for you. But it's a bit technical, and I don't expect this to be, something that a wide audience wants to read, but it's going to be out there soon. So if you hear what we talked about today and you're like, I really want to learn more about this, there's a book called Principles of NATTO that is going to come out very, very soon, in which we talk about many things, including the one struggle. And I think this is another theme that I think is so helpful to understand, because when we think of largely what's called mental health today, we can get the impression that there's a wide variety of disorders that can afflict us. We can become depressed. We can have we can struggle with our weight. We can have problems with addiction. We can have OCD, PTSD. There's an incredible amount of disorders described under this umbrella of like mental health, and that can be tricky, because whenever we're facing something that seems like daunting and complex and we don't know how to meet it, that in itself gives rise to a lot of difficulties for us. On the other hand, when we can unify everything into the kind of like the smallest common denominator, the simplest way we can understand it, I think that's very, very helpful. And I think the vast majority of what we call mental health today can be understood as one struggle. And we've already talked about how tokenization can help us see this, where we can see that the token is sort of interchangeable. Anything can be tokenized, or many things can be tokenized, and it leads to a very similar struggle to when something else was tokenized. It's just like it optically looks different just because there were different things that were tokenized. But another way we can see this is by using that universal code and seeing that depending on what element of the universal code we look at the inner struggle through, it can look at as if there are many different struggles when there's actually just one. And I'm going to use an example to illustrate this. Henok is a friend of ours. And let's say that Henok had a car accident, and now he's just constantly thinking about that car accident. He has intrusive thoughts about it. He's quote unquote obsessing about it. And he's feeling sad all the time. He's feeling low and sad all the time. He's mostly staying inside. And he started to drink alcohol as ways to not feel the way he's feeling. and he's gained quite a bit of weight. Now, let's say that Henok shares this in a clinic with a, in some part of the kind of mainstream healthcare system. Henok shares this, and we can ponder for a second what Henok may be diagnosed with. What is the diagnosis that he will leave with when he shares this? Well, it turns out that all depends. If we would focus on the fact that he has like constant thoughts about this trauma that happened in the past, then we may say that Henok has PTSD, because there was really something traumatic that happened, and that is not consuming his life. He's thinking about it all the time, right? So we may see that, okay, his constant thoughts about the trauma, he has PTSD. Now, we may also say that he has these, like, we may also focus not on the circumstance of the fact that he had a traumatic event, but we can focus on his thoughts and the nature of his thoughts. And we can say, like, oh, he has these intrusive thoughts all the time. He's obsessing about things. Oh, this is OCD. This is something in the OCD realm. He may live with that diagnosis. Or we can focus on his emotions and say that he's constantly sad, and therefore say that he's depressed. So he may be diagnosed with major depression. Or the focus can be on his behavior. We can focus on the fact that he's consuming a lot of alcohol and say that, oh, he has a substance abuse disorder. That could be diagnosis. Or finally, one may say that, oh, he has gained a lot of weight. That's another issue here. He also has a weight disorder. So Henok may have been told that he has several diagnoses, and he may also have been told that he needs trauma-informed therapy for the PTSD. He may need counseling for his OCD. He may need an antidepressant for his depression. He needs to join a 12-step program for his substance abuse, and he needs to see a dietitian. And you can see that this can make Henok think that something is really off with him. Like, he has this multitude of disorders that are afflicting him, and he needs many different treatment modalities to cure him, which you can sense is quite a heavy thing to be thinking. Alternatively, we can explain everything he's gone through using our tokenization framework and our universal code. So we can say that what happened was Henok did have this accident that is a circumstance, but that the memories of that had been tokenized. When he thinks about that memory, he may have thought about that memory at some point and felt a wave of sadness, let's say, and he was thinking, no, I don't want to feel this way. This memory is not good for me. I don't want to have this memory. I want to get away from this memory. I want to escape this memory. In other words, what I'm describing is he's treating this memory as a threat, as something dangerous. The memory of the car accident has been tokenized. And when we know that, we can place this tokenization as a circumstance in our universal code, and we can see that the circumstance of the car accident being tokenized leads to thoughts, because circumstances leads to thought, right? So this memory has been tokenized, and when anything to us appears as a threat, we humans are going to think a lot about it. That's part of our problem solving. We're going to think and think and think and think about something until we find a way to escape this threat, right? But the tricky thing here is that memory cannot be escaped, right? Which is, leads to maybe another discussion. But our point here is that we first have the circumstance of the memory being tokenized, and now we can see that when anything has been tokenized, we're going to think a lot about this. So it's not like a disorder or a surprise to us that he has these intrusive thoughts or constantly thinking about something, obsessing about something. That is expected when we think of anything as a threat, right? So now we've explained, we've seen that if you look at the fact that he had an accident and he's thinking about it, if you look at that through like the kind of mainstream lens, it looks like PTSD. But in our lens, we just say, okay, this is just tokenization of memories, right? And now we've seen that at the next level of our universal code, if we think about the fact that Henok is having these obsessive thoughts, then through the mainstream lens, it can look like, oh, he has OCD. But in our frame, we can see like, oh no, this is just thought. This is just his thinking about a tokenized event. Same thing with the next step, which is emotion. If we look through the mainstream lens and we look at, oh, he's depressed all the time, yeah, we may label this as depression. But through our lens, we just say, well, of course, emotions flow from thoughts. And if we think of something as a threat that we can't do anything about, it is very logical for the brain to deploy sadness. So this now all makes sense. Similarly, when it comes to behavior, when we are thinking of something as a threat and we have unpleasant emotions, we very often want to not feel that way. It's very typical for us humans to attempt to escape how we feel by changing our behavior. For example, drinking alcohol, right? And so now we see that this is not another disorder, another condition, another affliction. This is just a logical next step in our universal code. And same thing with weight gain. It's not like this is another disorder here. It's simply the kind of physiological expected result of more caloric intake, which was due to the attempt of escaping the emotion, which was coming from how we thought about a circumstance, right? We have weight gain. There's nothing surprising to us at all. It is just, a natural progression from this one tokenization event. And what this helps us to see is that there is but one struggle. Once you've seen this, once you've seen the struggle from this lens with this framework, you can see that it applies to everything we think of today as mental health. Not 100%. Like there are some things like like, for example, like a person with nonverbal autism, that's not thought dependent. That has nothing to do with how we think about it. But the vast majority of what we call mental health today, mental health struggles, mental health disorders, can be seen as just variations, just facets of the one same struggle. This one struggle can look like different struggles depending on what has been tokenized and what level of this universal code we look at. But in reality, there is just one struggle. The substrate for that struggle is tokenization. How we meet that struggle is by befriending. And this is a great, great simplification and unification that is now encapsulated in our framework, which we call NATTO. And this is a conclusion of this presentation for you that I hope you have found really intriguing, valuable, and helpful. And going forward again, there will be a book coming out that those of you who really want to deep dive in this might find really, really interesting, Principles of NATTO. And beyond that, maybe we'll have a playlist on this. Surely you will see that these teachings will echo in our kind of our future content. Will we mainly use this for what I think of as fractals? A fractal is when we see like a version of the inner struggle in kind of smaller shape within a larger shape. So for example, somebody may say like, I really struggle with insomnia. I also have panic attacks. The panic attack is a fractal. It's the same thing as insomnia, it just appears smaller, right? So we can very well use this, like the framework we just presented, the ideas we just presented, NATTO 2.0, we could use that just in our own work for insomnia. So we can explain to somebody with insomnia who also has, this fractal, what's going on and how to befriend that too, using the same principles and same teachings. And then we can ask ourselves, do we want to really work on providing NATTO-based offers, teachings, content for somebody who's not even struggling with sleep? Because it applies there. Maybe. I'm not sure. But it's something that I think the future will decide, for now, I'll just say that I'm so glad you tuned in for this. Thank you for being here. I hope this brought a lot of value your way. And as always, feel free to leave your comments in the comment section. I'll see you very soon. Bye for now.